Welcome, everyone. I'm Mark Rifkin. I'm the Linda Arnold Carlisle Distinguished Excellence Professor in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Professor of English at UNCG. I would ask everyone to keep their mics off and their cameras turned off and to pin the view to the speaker. Also, if people can refrain from using the everyone chat, let's just save that for questions when we get to question and answer. So I'd like to begin. I'd also like to note that this session is being recorded, but I'd also like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I am in Durham right now, and I'm on Occaneechi, Tuscarora, and Saponi lands. And UNCG is on the lands of the Kiawe and Sora peoples, as well as other Saponi peoples who have lived and do live in the region. I should note that this presentation is part of the Linda Arnold Carlisle Professorship. Thank you very much to Linda Carlisle and the Friends of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies for making possible the professorship and this event. And also, I'd like to thank the English department for co-hosting, co-sponsoring the event. A little bit about the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program at UNCG. It was founded in 1972. This is actually our 50th anniversary year. It's one of the oldest in the country. The program has 3 degree programs, a bachelor's, a master's, and a graduate certificate program. So folks at UNCG send students the program's way. Folks not at UNCG send students the program's way. I'd also like to thank Lisa Levenstein, who is the director of WGSS, Kelly Taylor, who is the program administrator, and Asa Eager of the Humanities Network at UNCG, all who contributed greatly to this program. Today's presentation is the second in a 4-part series on new work in queer and trans studies. The last 2 panels focused on Latinx studies and Asian American studies will be in the spring on February 24th and March 31st. So let me introduce our speakers in the order in which they'll be speaking. Dr. Bey is Assistant Professor of African American Studies and English and core faculty in Gender and Sexuality Studies and Critical Theory at Northwestern University. Their work is in Black studies, feminist theory, transgender and non-binary studies, and abolition. Dr. Bey is the author most recently of 2 books, Black Trans Feminism and System Failure, Essays on Blackness and Cisgender, both published with Duke University Press in 2022. Dr. Adeyemi is Associate Professor of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Washington. Her writing and curatorial projects use performance as a site and methodology for theorizing the contours of contemporary Black queer life. She is the author of Feels Right, Black Queer Women and the Politics of Partying in Chicago, published by Duke University Press last month, actually, in September 2022. And she's also the co-editor of Queer Nightlife from University of Michigan Press, 2021. Dr. Bey and Dr. Adeyemi each will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a question and answer. Again, if folks could leave the everyone chat clear, and then when we move to question and answer, you can feel free to pose questions there, or people will be able to raise their hands and I'll call on them. But we'll begin with Dr. Bey.
All right, thank you so much. I'm assuming everyone can hear me. So thank you all so much for coming, for being here. I'm so humbled by the invitation to be in conversation and community with folks. So I'm going to be reading a talk that I've entitled The Black, the Trans, and the Feminist, an Abolitionist Endeavor. And I always find myself giving a kind of preface or some prefatory remarks before I say things, because when I say things, sometimes it sounds a type of way to folks, but I'm actually going to try to not do those prefatory remarks outside of this prefatory remark and just kind of allow the work to speak and to allow folks to receive it in the way that they will and ask the question and make the comments that you all feel that you want to make in light of the things that I share. So I will begin. The Black, the Trans, and the Feminist, an Abolitionist Endeavor. Many of us might know of a practice that, at least to me, was made noteworthy by Sylvia Wynter, the practice of guide quotes. Guide quotes, as I understand them, are not simply epigraphs, though I love those too. Rather, they are references, indexes into other intellectual and socio-political life worlds that the present text lives with and moves through. They guide the thinking in the present text. So I want to offer some guide quotes that have helped what I will present to you all today as being possible. These guide quotes have helped these thoughts live. So a few guide quotes, and I apologize for not having images of these quotes, but I hope you'll forgive me. Guide quote 1 is by Fred Moten in The Universal Machine. Quote, as Fanon asserts, there is an imposition onto the figure of the Black that would signify the confluence of racial identity and racial inferiority. There is also, in a way that is prior to the regulative force of that imposition and calls it into question, a resource working through the epidermalization of aphantasmatic inferiority as the anti-epidermalization of the radical alternative, to which the peoples who are called Black have a kind of underprivileged relation in and as the very history of that imposition. This is Fred's characteristic wordiness. One might speak then of the blackening of the common, which would imply neither that any and every person who is called Black claims or defends the sociopoetic force of that fantasy, nor that persons who are not called Black are disqualified from making such claims and enacting such defense, unquote. Again, that is Fred Moten, The Universal Machine. The second guide quote by Hortense Spillers, The Scholarly Journey of Hortense Spillers. But I need to make a distinction between Black women as a subject of feminism, and Black feminism as a critical disposition. I should like to think that Black feminism as a repertoire of concepts, practices, and alignments is progressive in outlook and dedicated to the view that sustainable life systems must be available to everyone, unquote. The third epigraph is from Che Gossett's article, Zizek's Transgender Trouble. Quote, from the Combahee River Collective and its critique of biological essentialism as a dangerous and reactionary basis upon which to build a politic, to trans genealogies of Black feminism is always already trans, unquote. And the last guide quote is from Denise Ferreira da Silva, Hacking the Subject, Black Feminism and Refusal Beyond the Limits of Critique. Quote, the Black feminist position as trouble, it refuses to disappear into the general categories of otherness or objecthood, that is, Blackness and womanhood, and refuses to comply with the formulations of racial and gender sexual emancipatory projects these categories guide, unquote. So those are the 4 guide quotes for us. At base, I'm here to meditate with you all, with my esteemed colleague here with me today, about my preoccupations, my obsessions with what I've gathered under the heading of Black trans feminism. It is, of course, the title of my recent book, or at least one of my recent books, which this talk is based in. But it is also, for me, a modality of moving and relating and inhabiting, or exhabiting. With each of these terms, they are guided by an archive, one I consider radical and abolitionist. And thus these terms are guided outside of themselves in service of being reconfigured and undone, making necessary here a bit of an account of how these terms, the Black, the trans, the feminist, are circulating in the context of this abolitionist endeavor that I've titled this talk. So when it comes to Blackness, something I've been approaching and tinkering with and been approached and tinkered by, I cannot but move in relation to it by way of a recalibrated definition. This recalibrated definition is not to extricate a certain experiential expertise from the specifics of a demographic. Best believe that I know very well the importance of this, both experientially as well as interpersonally. My aim in this recalibration, for which I am, you might notice, bearing the lead, is to reveal the capaciousness of the term and indeed practice a revelation in service of a radical overturning of the purported natural order of things. This recalibrated Blackness moves to the tune of a refusal of the discretion that inheres in categorization. Put differently, I propose Blackness as referential of an analytic, which is to say a posture in politic, a penchant in disposition, of mutinous relationality to impose ontology. To quote our Black feminist go-to, Hortense Spillers, as she writes in the introduction to our essay collection, Black, White, and in Color, quote, Blackness serves, following a radical reading of Ralph Ellison, as, quote, a symbolic program of philosophical disobedience, a systematic skepticism and refusal that would make the former available to anyone, or more pointedly, any posture that was willing to take on the formidable task of thinking as a willful act of imagination and invention, unquote. The trends of this meditation references, for me and others, something not quite beholden to medico-juridical tenets of sufficient alteration of anatomy or physiognomy, not to the exclusion of such alterations, though also not to the reduction to such alterations. Trans indexes rather the unfixing of gender from essentialist moorings and posits itself precisely as that unfixation, as a departure from, without the presumption of a stable destination, or indeed a departure that itself destabilizes destinational desires. This transness is endemic to a genealogy that has at its foundation the fundamental critique of the capaciousness of man, or capital M man, and woman, as such, the critique of the regulative regime of normative gender and categorization. Trans, in other words, marks a way of exceeding and refusing the ravages of gender's imposition and insists on the inability to discern one's identification simply by making recourse to the visual. With respect to the feminist, which is to say the Black and trans feminist, emergent is an incessant critique, a creative critique, or a critique that serves to build through a vitiation of regulative gender normative circumscriptions. Insofar as the feminism I move through sees gender itself, not certain iterations of gender, as a mode of harm doing, yet nevertheless a mode through which we move, albeit by subtle and spectacularized force, this feminism that is Black and trans feminism operates at a Spillersian level. As she notes in a conversation about her famed 1987 essay, the only essay it seems many have read by her, which I have many feelings about. Spiller says, quote, you have to sort of see that and get beyond it, that is gender, and get to something else, because you are trying to go through gender to get to something wider, unquote. That wider cannot be encompassed, not even close, in the racialized and gendered language and categorization that we have. And this I am quite steadfast about. Often have I gotten into a bit of trouble regarding how I approach and exude Black feminist theorizing. What about Black women? Black feminism is about Black women. And of course, those who level this as a rejoinder to what I offer are not wrong. But I move differently, in concert with a different course, a course comprised of Denise Ferreira da Silva and Hortense Spillers, whose guide quotes advise something more radically liberatory than what is leveled, a course comprised of Farah Jasmine Griffin, who has written in on the legacy of Black feminism, quote, Black feminism is never only about Black women, it's never been this. It's about a more just world, unquote. A course comprised of those going through gender to get to something much, much wider, something given shape or non-shape to me by Black trans feminism. This all brings us to the latter portion of this meditation, the ways that the Black and trans and feminist, or the Black trans feminist, converge into a project of abolition and abolitionist endeavor. We likely know the now famous Moten and Harney definition of abolition, and we also likely know the ways Angela Davis and Miriam Kaba and Erica Miners and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, excuse me, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore all ground knowledge of abolition as such. In a synthesis of these key thinkers, I want to offer abolition as a name for the cultivation of a life and livelihood whose emergence actualizes via the impossibility of violence. Abolition as that which calls and invites us into an otherwise mode of life, where the circumscriptions, normativities, realities, laws, and the like do not and cannot enter, opening up massively different possibilities, perhaps even impossibilities. Perhaps what is meant by the abolitionist is a way of orienting to the world and others that seeks insistently to eradicate forms of carcerality and violence, a way of trying to be with others in ways that do not curtail their possibilities or dispose of them or punish them by violating the thing they might want to be for themselves. The abolitionist, in short, tries to make the very framework of capture and punitivity nonsensical. It is not reactive against bad prisons, but a way to make forms of carcerality impossible. Allow me, please, a quote from scholar Dylan Rodriguez. Quote, abolition seeks, as it performs, a radical reconfiguration of justice, subjectivity, and social formation that does not depend on the existence of either the carceral state, a statecraft that institutionalizes various forms of targeted human capture, or carceral power as such, a totality of state-sanctioned and extra-state relations of gendered racial colonial dominance, unquote. What Rodriguez provides me, and I think us in our politics, which is understood broadly more than just partisan governmental politics, but politics as an insistence on how we wish our world to be and what we will and must do to create that world. What Rodriguez provides us in our politics is a demand to radically reconfigure what counts as work and agitation and imagination, what it looks like to live in a just society and world, what it looks like to be a valid being and person and subject, what is possible for how we move alongside one another. All of these things in a way that does not rely on carcerality. There are so many ways that the carceral limits what we are able to be. Of course, there are institutions that cage people on unjust grounds, detention centers and jails that deeply negatively affect queer and trans people. But there's also the carcerality of the gender binary, of colonialism, of our very ways of talking to and about people we care for. What would a world without even that be like for us? I want to begin from this vantage to imagine that, because I think we deserve it. This is a fundamentally political endeavor, not so much an identificatory one. The emphasis on the political scope of this, to be a bit more precise, is not to imply that those of us falling within some permutation of Black and trans and woman, those of us who are racialized in ways that disallows movement and enactments, those who have certain reproductive capacities that are legislated in certain ways, or those whose corporeal comportments are subordinated via cis-hetero patriarchy, those of us who are gender nonconforming or non-binary or depart in whatever way from the gender we've been and continue to be assigned, not to imply that we must always, in our very being, be doing radical things. Certainly, we deserve very much to rest, to not have to defend ourselves at every turn, though we know this is crucial for survivability. I don't mean to place an added burden onto us. Rather, the distinction I make lovingly so for the Black and trans and feminists here opens them up to anyone doing a particular kind of work with respect to or with disrespect to the ravages of gender. It is, following the wonderful scholar activist Kathy Cohen, not merely an identity that one possesses and that's it. These terms mark a subversive relation to power that is moved in and out of, that is open and attentive to how we relate and, importantly, to how we wish to create different kinds of worlds. There is deep validity to the typical ways people combat injustices and fight against systems of oppression, policy change, protests and marches and the like. I, however, want to offer another way among these ways, a way that is perhaps quieter, but no less loud, subtler, but no less impactful. The kind of abolitionist radicality I want to propose is one that invites a different way of relating. That relation is one that encounters others on grounds of openness, refusing the foreclosure that is assigning gender or imposing an archive onto others before they even arrive onto the scene of encounter. It is one that commits to the sociality of being and becoming other than what we've been said we need to be. I know these seem small, and they are, but I want to hope that they bear on how we feel with others, what we think with and about others, because the smallest refusal of imposing onto someone else a pronoun might usher in the refusal to gender that person, the refusal to predetermine that person. And that right there might be the first time they felt truly, if only fleetingly free, and that matters to me. Abolition is not one spectacularized event, but a constant working toward eradicating carceral logics as necessary for sociality and relationality. Like what Sarah Lamble terms everyday abolition, I offer abolition as changing the ways we interact with others on an ongoing basis and changing harmful patterns in our daily lives, questioning punitive impulses and relations of captivity. This is abolition in a broad sense, the making impossible and creation of a sociality indexed to the impossibility of carcerality, any form of captivity. We create abolition and do abolition in each moment we move toward the alleviation of subtle ways of curtailing the ability of anyone to become liberated. More than just resistance, abolition is made here to engender Black trans feminism is committed to moving, quote, beyond the state in service of collective liberation, unquote, making a founding coalitional drive constitutive of it. It is also a call for something other than epistemic mastery over where we should go from here. How might we engender a provocation to care more than we can know, to extend our analyses past the ruins of the world and the discipline as we know it? We do not need to know for certain the parameters of what comes after this hellish landscape, and perhaps we cannot know if we are truly to get to a place not beholden to existing modes of conceptualization. What is primary is that we care for and about one another's livelihoods. We then cultivate the conditions that can lovingly accommodate such livelihoods. I'm not all that good at the practical and the concrete, being a critical theorist and being trained by philosophers. So I apologize for not providing a blueprint, but I do think that part of the non-concreteness is purposeful and perhaps is itself practical advice, that there is a way we can remain loose and unsettled, unsedimented as a practice of justice. That looseness opens up doors, in fact, unhinges the bolts on doors so that there are no doors, and that is scary. But I submit the Black and trans and feminist as letting that door dissolve without a bouncer checking names, which means that whoever shows up will be let in unconditionally and without conditions. The person who has identified as trans for 1 hour is included in this, as well as the person who is looking to learn more, who might have some gender normative baggage, but is nevertheless trying to leave that, as well as to the person who might not think too highly of departures from racialized gender. Yes, the law might send agents to infiltrate our conspiratorial sessions, but I hope that does not inspire fear in us, though I know that fear is real. Why would we let in someone or something that might harm us, especially in a space we hoped was safe? I suppose all I might say about this is that I want so very much to expand the people who love and fight and care and affirm and proliferate the possibility of us, which of course includes us. So I am promoting via an abolitionist framework of refusing to dispose of anyone, refusing to say that someone does not measure up or say that someone is irredeemable, promoting this non-exclusivity because the very scary and risky possibility in that is that those who do not want us to exist might be moved to become otherwise. Because also, entering into the new world, the new mode of relating, means that whoever enters will not and cannot be the same. The relation touches them such that they are no longer the same as before they entered, and that shift can be everything. Blackness and transness and feminism might be precisely in their openness, the cultivation of the soil such that it might be lush terrain for those who have not been permitted to arrive onto the scene. So moving to my conclusion. We know it is important and boilerplate at this point to enumerate the dead. This is an ethical gesture, one with crucial implications. I am not someone who pedestals a mere remembrance of the dead, those who have met their deaths by anti-Black or trans-antagonistic or patriarchal violence, nor am I someone who wishes only for marginalized people to be alive despite everything we might face. I am, in other words, as you might guess, not very interested in ends and endings, which is not to say that they are unimportant. It is to say that the end is not the point, not where the work is done, not where we are made to be aware of an injustice. What is unjust is precisely what precedes the supposed ends. What is unjust are the terms of living, as Cameron Awkward Rich, Black trans poet, writes. There is something deeply unsettling, that is, to the insistence that someone ought to be alive in a world that did little to support that life, he says. And I feel that deeply, I do. And it is exactly this that propels me always to think about, mobilize around, how the terms of living might be cultivated such that they finally allow for not even only those who were barred from that social world, but even those who we didn't even know existed. And this right here is where we might find our abolitionist politics, making and insisting on a world that is cultivated for those we knew not existed, and we will love them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to Dr. Adeyemi.
Hi, let me share my screen quick. And I know you had said for folks to not necessarily, be chatting, but I actually enjoy that kind of feedback loop while I'm talking. So please feel free to chat and be present in that kind of way. Let's see. So my talk is kind of opposite, I think, in tone and outcome, Marquis, which I think is a good thing. But today I'm asking a question that people have been asking for years: where are all the Black studs? And I asked this question in my book that was published just like 3 weeks ago last month, which is called Feels Right: Black Queer Women and the Politics of Partying in Chicago. And I really get into this question in the third chapter of my book, which is in many ways about the methodologies of Black studies, queer studies, and performance studies, and how they're rooted in and depend upon the palpability of the event as a kind of rupture in time and space that allows us to sort of see and assess differences. And so in that chapter, I'm talking about what I call the event potentiality matrix, which overdetermines who appears in academic thought and how, especially, namely who are the people who can afford to appear in public in certain kinds of ways, and how does our academic attention sort of consolidate around them. And then, I work in, sort of nightlife studies. And so in the broader literature on nightlife and queer nightlife, those people are primarily gay men. And so in that chapter, I'm really trying to outline the conditions in which Black lesbians do not appear, both in public everyday life and also related in academic thought. And I'm sort of arguing in that chapter that has to do with the many ways that Black lesbian subjectivities, by virtue of the riskiness that comes with the event, that comes with sort of appearing in public, they're sort of rendered kind of ordinary, uneventful, unprofitable to kind of academic thought. And that's what I was, going to be presenting. That's what I was going to, talk about today. But I have been really sort of thinking about a couple of things that have happened in academic life lately that have returned me to this question of where are all the Black studs, but kind of from a different sort of perspective or framework or orientation. And it's a question that's kind of playful because, of course, we know that Black studs, Black lesbians are everywhere all of the time. But the task of asking that question and going about finding an answer to that question, I think requires a different kind of labor when it comes to critical thinking that I kind of just enjoy doing rather than repeating something that I already know, to myself. So I've been asking this particular question a lot lately because I have been trying to work through my frustrations with watching the recent Loophole of Retreat conference in Venice, which was convened in celebration of the occasion of Simone Lee, who's an artist, being selected to represent the United States in the US pavilion. And the retreat, so there's the exhibition, which we can see in the top slide, and my slides are terrible. So, these are not artistic slides, they're very utilitarian. In the top left, we can see a photo of the installation itself. But there was also a retreat that happened in conjunction with the exhibition. And so the retreat was a gathering of Black women in celebration of a Black woman artist who, deserves all that, is coming to her, all of the respect, all of the accolades, all of the money. And Lee's work is produced in close conversation of the retreat with other Black women who've also been paying their dues and deserve heaps of attention and respect. Yeah, so that's what I'll say about that. So I was watching the loophole retreat convening happening on social media, people posting about being there. I was watching the actual sort of documentation of the sessions that were being held, and a lot of people who I love were there, and a lot of people who I respect were there. But I was increasingly challenged by the point that even though there were plenty, I recognized everybody who was there, even if I didn't know who they were as individuals, because I recognized that what I was seeing was the consolidation of an elite Black feminist identity, what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it thinks about, where it goes, right? And I recognized what it looks like for a body and a politics and a conversation to become normative and folded into the state and its academic and cultural institutions. I think it's not surprising that this consolidation of Black feminist identity was made possible by a World's Fair style art exhibition supported by public and private money that serves as an opportunity to simultaneously honor the cultural production of nations, and in the context of the US Pavilion, honor the very people who had long been excluded from that very definition of the nation. So it's not surprising that for the last 3 biennials, the US Pavilion has been staffed by Black people as part of the sort of longer history of the US's so-called reckoning with Blackness, with race, with the legacy of slavery that undergirds the production of the state. So in 2017, it was Mark Bradford on the lower part of the slide there, Martin Puryear in 2019, and then of course, most recently, Simone Lee in 2022. So this accumulation of Black practices into the US's narration of itself and its cultural production for a hyper-capitalist art market is an important part of US statecraft that we need to continue to unpack. And part of the reason I don't have, I'm not going to necessarily unpack that right now, in these 20 minutes, is because I remain too distracted by this other sort of more superficial question that has been plaguing me, as I followed along with the loophole of retreat from a distance, right? Where are all of the Black dykes? Where are the studs, the masks, the aggressive, the boys at the retreat itself, right? And at one level, it is a superficial question, right? So where are the people I can recognize as inhabiting what I interpret as a visibly lesbian sexuality, one that's communicated through clothing or hair, posture, stance, whatever it may be. So it is a superficial question in that it assumes the intelligibility of the stud can be registered, in the sort of quotidian performatives. Certainly there were lesbian studs, dykes in the crowd at the retreat. We know that there certainly had to be at least, but I didn't see them and a critical mass of them. And so of course we should always put pressure on seeing as knowing, right? But sometimes you just know. This is where the question of where are all the Black studs is more complex than a reading of what can be seen on the body. Yes, where are all the Black studs is at one level superficial. It reflects my desire to engage in a kind of superficial visual network, but the appearance of absence tells us something about how gender and sexuality collide at something like the loophole of retreat convening, and about how Black genders and sexualities surface the intersections of the academy, the art world, and the state as they work together to produce the so-called proper object of inquiry, or the proper place of Black feminist inquiry in particular. So the appearance of absence tells us something about the relationship between these three sites, the academy, the art world, and the state, and how they depend upon and reproduce a very particular story about, or a very, sort of narrow vision of Black gender and sexuality. So within this particular and narrow vision, we can ask, where are all the Black studs? And we can ask in the sort of inverse, why are there so many Black femmes? And this is not an arrangement that is meant to inaugurate or reaffirm a kind of binary conceptualization of Black gender and its attendant forms of sexuality. It's more an attempt to highlight and consider when specific forms of Black gender and sexuality become visible. And in the particular case of the loophole convening, how these specific forms of Black gender and sexuality visualize these intersections of the academy, the art world, and the state, and of course, how capitalism is sustaining all three of those formations. I'm just looking at that comment. That's my favorite Instagram account. These questions, where are the Black studs, and or why are there so many Black femmes, rely on modes of sight that will always fail us. Yet taking these questions seriously can help us unpack what the politics of Black queer, trans, and feminist inquiry looks like right now, and can help us unpack how we got to this now in the first place, all in the effort of developing more interesting, challenging, and creative, critical thinking. That said, and with an eye toward the new and the more interesting and the challenging, nothing I'm saying right now is new. Sharon Holland has said it, Evelyn Hammonds has said it, Erica Edwards, so many people have said it, right? But the fact that we have to keep saying it, keep asking this question, should further tell us something about the endurance of certain forms of bodies and thinking in the institutions that the state operationalizes in its own cultural imperialism. What does it mean to celebrate Black women when there is a prohibitive cost of entry, right? What does it mean to celebrate Black women when it's state-sponsored? What does it mean to take place within the fascist Italian state? What does it mean when celebrating Black women looks like celebrating Black femmes visiting the fascist Italian state that is hosting a convention of participants in the global capitalist art market? Erica Edwards writes, if in the context of the post-1945 period's experiments with racial incorporation, Black women's lives and Black women's culture have now been hailed by gender categories such as woman, mother, and wife, which both eroticize and rationalize capitalism, then the task of the Black feminist critic is not only to theorize the social subject who, according to Hortense Spiller's foundational work, is cast out of the traditional symbolics of female gender, but also to make a place in theory for the social subject who is thrust into such symbolics. Drawing on the work of Spillers in particular, we have become increasingly skilled at, as Edwards writes, understanding those subjects who are cast out of the traditional symbolics of female gender, namely Black women, and understanding the intellectual labor we have done and continue to do to understand how methods of assigning and categorizing value move in step with the ongoing refinements of capitalism and state power. So to be very brief about it, strains of Black feminist theory have become skilled at using this framework to instantiate our own value within critical theory, but also the academy, sort of broader and broader sort of social society. As Black women have historically been cast out of traditional symbolics of female gender, which shape and constrain our material realities, we have built important and necessary careers out of re-narrating the possibilities of Black gender and, to a lesser extent, Black sexuality from within the confines of critical theory and academic institutions, right? Where Spillers, Edwards, and others highlight how Black women's lives and cultures have been hailed by gender categories such as, I guess I'll leave this up just to keep it. Okay, let me start that again. Where Spillers, Edwards, and others highlight how Black women's lives and cultures have been hailed by gender categories such as woman, mother, and wife, so too has the category of Black feminist accumulated a gender value, where especially in the elite confines of institutionalized feminism, there is a collapsing of Black feminist with femme. Within elite, institutionally affiliated Black feminism, the femme gender performance is overrepresented, and importantly, the Black femme feminist has become part of the very project of eroticizing and rationalizing capitalism, evidenced in no small part by the visuality of who is in attendance at the Loophole of Retreat convening. Following Edwards, who is following Spillers, we have to attend to those who are cast out of traditional symbolics of female gender, but we also have to make place in theory for how the social subject is thrust into symbolics. The question of why are there no Black studs must move in step with the question of how Black femmes and Black femme feminists in particular appear in the first place, and appear as a sort of normative logic, I should say, within sort of critical inquiry. What about the logics of nation building, elite academic institutions, and the art market provide the conditions in which the Black femme is overrepresented at the Loophole of Retreat conference? What about the intersections of these three sites produces a kind of Black gender normativity, even amongst Black feminists, with the precise skills to re-theorize and rebuild the mechanisms through which we are hailed into bodies and community? How is it that we continue to produce the same forms of gendered and sexualized normativity that the scholars that we continue to read and cite for decades have cautioned us against? Evelyn Hammonds asks this last question of a sort in the essay Black Holes, when she interrogates conservative approaches to the question of sexuality amongst Black feminist critics. She describes the ways that the limited discourse around the diversity of Black genders and sexualities is a product, in part, of the violence of the institution, but also the ontological violence that surrounds the category of Black woman itself. I can't screenshot. Marquis, can you see my screen still?
Yep,
The shared.
I can see it. It starts with Spillers made this point over a decade ago.
Wait.
That's the shot that's up.
Oh,
now,
okay.
Now it's just you.
I have to reshare this one. Wait, this whole time has it been my page that you've been seeing?
No. We've been seeing you've been moving back and forth between the image of the Venice Loophole of Retreat.
Yeah, okay.
And we saw the quote that you had used previously, but what was up a moment ago, it was a page of quote, or a page of writing with quote, right, that started with Spillers.
My secondary screen is screwed up, but that's okay. I'll just finish without it, because the only thing I was going to be putting up is text anyway. So let me just keep going here. Okay. Okay, so I'm talking about Evelyn Hammonds, right? Who's interrogating conservative approaches to the question of sexuality amongst Black feminist critics. To be brief, she describes the ways that the limited discourse around the diversity of Black genders and sexualities is a product, in part, of the violence of the institution, but also the ontological violence that surrounds the category of Black woman itself. So I'm gonna talk about a long passage that in Hammond's text. And if I weren't having a tech meltdown, I just really think it's easier to read things when you can also see it. But you know what I can do, actually? Let me drop it into the chat. So that for people who prefer to read along. Oh, you can't copy paste into Zoom, can you? Oh, technology.
It might just be, I've tried to do this before too. It might just be too long. So if you break it up, I think that might work too.
Okay, let's try that. Okay, good thinking. Okay, there's the first paragraph and the last line here. Okay. So Hammonds begins by quoting Hortense Spillers, writing that Spillers made this point over a decade ago when she wrote, quote, "Because Black American women do not participate as a category of social and cultural agents in the legacies of symbolic power, they maintain no allegiances to a strategic formation of texts or ways of talking about sexual experience that even remotely resemble the paradigm of symbolic domination, except that such a paradigm has been their concrete disaster, end quote. To date, through the work of Black feminist literary critics, we know more about the elision of sexuality by Black women than we do about the possible varieties of expression of sexual desire. The restrictive, repressive, and dangerous aspects of Black female sexuality have been emphasized by Black feminist writers, while pleasure, exploration, and agency have gone underanalyzed. I want to suggest that Black feminist theorists have not taken up this project in part because of their own status in the academy. Reclaiming the body as well as subjectivity is a process that Black feminist theorists in the academy must go through themselves while they're doing the work of producing theory. That's the end of Hammond's quote, where she's also citing Spillers. I want us to sit with this passage, and part of the reason why I wanted you to be able to see it continuously, because it is tracking a historical moment, one that we have sort of moved beyond in time, but also in some respect in terms of content and concepts. So for example, there's been a robust and ongoing Black feminist conversation about pleasure, exploration, and agency amongst Black women, and the attentions of sort of queer theory, queer studies, which Hammond's is really taking to task in that essay. Those attentions have been a little bit more marginally diversified, right? So we've sort of, to oversimplify, we've done the work in some respects that Hammond's is sort of talking about and calling for. But the historical transformations between when this essay is published in 1994 and now 2022 might clue us into how something like the Loophole of Retreat convening, a celebration of Black feminist production, can be so circumscribed by money, elitism, and nation building. Hammond follows Spillers in suggesting that the conservative strains of academic Black women's theorizations of the diversity of Black genders and sexualities is rooted in the ways that Black women have historically not participated in the legacies of symbolic power, right? That Black women have historically maintained no allegiances to a strategic formation of texts or ways of talking about sexual experience that even remotely resemble the paradigm of symbolic domination. This assumption, right, that line forms the basis of an intervention for a lot of Black feminist criticism, right? Highlighting the epistemic and ontological contours of Black woman as a category and as a subject position, and then tracking, how the symbolic exclusions of the category of Black woman materializes in the daily lives of individual Black women. But is this assumption still true? Can the logic of real and symbolic exclusion remain the basis of Black feminist inquiry in an era when we have been so institutionalized so thoroughly so as to be attractive to foundations, to the Guggenheim Foundation, attractive to the US government, attractive to academic institutions, to the art market, right? Our knowledge of how academic and arts institutions capture, neuter, and redeploy critical thinking, especially that which has been produced by minoritarian subjects, should force us to think a little bit more complexly about the structural institutional histories that have produced or that shape the manifestations of Black feminism since Hammond's and Spillers were writing. At this point, 2022, Black feminist thought has long been institutionalized, and I don't think I'm being too extreme when I say that Black feminist theory and practice has been specifically institutionalized through and as the Black femme body and perspective, which actually exerts an immense amount of symbolic power, if not domination, over the kinds of conversations we stage in academic and arts institutions. Lodged in and through the Black female body, this form of elite Black feminist theorizing is productive and profitable for the US state, an entity whose recognition of the femme subject, Black and otherwise, is whole, complete, and totalizing. So the perceived legibility of the Black femme feminist is the outcome of the so-called proper place of Black women's bodies and politics within institutions and within a nation that, in Jody Malamud's words, have long been primed to represent and destroy. Appearing through the framework of the US Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, the Black femme feminism on display is the perfect outcome of official or state-recognized anti-racisms as liberal modes of instituting normative and rationalizing power. That's Melamad's words. So what to make of my original question? Where are all the Black studs? Is that a question that is an effort to affirm a place, proper and otherwise, within the normative and rationalizing power of Black feminism and the US state alike? Is it an innocent, if self-serving question propelled by my own erotic desires? Is it a question that is a directive regarding the ways that we bring one another into community? It's kind of all of these things at the same time, but I'm just going to kind of, attend to the last one as a kind of finishing point and a way to kind of open us into conversation. There are quite simply many ways that Black feminist criticism can be staged beyond the perspective of the femme and her relations of power. At a really kind of mechanical material level, how much work are you reading or citing or assigning that engages with, for example, a Black stud perspective, a Black lesbian narrative, work that does not redeploy Black sexuality as an empty sign for non-normativity or deviation or radical politics? What efforts are you doing on your admissions committees and your search committees to ensure that the vision of Blackness that you have encompasses gender diversity, diversity of sexuality, diversity of class, diversity of institutional affiliation? Those aren't like questions that are devoted to like enhancing our, DEI, metrics. They are questions that acknowledge that the consolidation of Black feminism at something like the Loophole of Retreat Conference is part of a much larger system that advantages people who can pass into normative body regimes and at the same time reproduce the kind of intellectual logic that continually justifies and reifies that regime as normative. The streamlining of who and what Black feminists are and how they think is managed by the fact that Black people with resources in the academic world and in the art world surround themselves with other people with resources in the academic world and the art world, right? It's like, what are those things that come out like every now and then where there's like a postdoc position and somebody pulls out the stats that says over the last 50 years, this postdoc has been filled by the same, graduates from the same 3 Ivy League institutions or, since forever. We in the academy, especially in those sites that we claim are producing a kind of radical politics or even just a sort of left-leaning liberal politics, have to acknowledge the ways that we reproduce those kinds of lateral exchanges in a sort of really small scale way that we think are non-consequential, but are extremely consequential when they accumulate at something like everybody looking the same, everybody coming from the same background, everybody having the same language at, the fucking Venice Biennale. So we are continually giving money, opportunities, and thought laterally on horizontal routes of exchange. And many people have been disadvantaged in the process, to say nothing about the ways that intellectual exchange sort of documented by publication records, for example, has been really affected. So thinking about the visuality of who is on view at the Loophole of Retreat convening is important, not as a singular event, but how that retreat is an example and a symbol of the landing points of contemporary Black feminist practice, which consolidate around the femme subject, the femme perspective, the femme practice as the normative, embodied and intellectual and creative regime through which something like politics, can kind of happen or issue forth. The visual consolidation of the Black feminist at the Loophole and events like it is the accumulation of the proper place of the Black woman academic within the academy, within the art world, as a tool and as a mechanism of the US state. That this proper place is supported by and directly and indirectly in the service of capital accumulation and exploitation, both in the form of the sort of the nation format and the sort of individual academic, US American academic format, cannot be understated. that this proper place has been achieved through the harnessing of Black feminist critiques of the symbolic orders of white supremacy cannot be understated, right? The result, which is the continuing obfuscation of gendered and sexual diversity within and surrounding Blackness, broadly construed, cannot be understated. I'm just gonna leave it there.
Thank you very much. And now we'll open it up for questions. If folks want to type questions into the chat, or if you'd like to raise your hand and then, speak your question. So while folks are thinking, I'm wondering if our speakers have questions possibly for each other.
I always do. And thank you so much for that. That was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And I think I just want to open with a question that I found myself increasingly interested in, because we know that academic work is quite isolating, and I'll use the word cerebral. I'm always wondering about how it feels to do the work that we do. So I guess I want to just raise the question if you could speak to whatever extent you feel comfortable. What does it feel, or what has it felt like to do the work that you do, to be in the spaces that you find yourself in, and to also receive whatever kind of commentary or feedback you've gotten on the work that you do, because there's a kind of affective life of all of this. So I'm quite curious about that, to whatever extent you feel comfortable sharing.
If you mean this particular work, this is the first time I wrote that this morning. So I, in part because in terms of like feeling, I was prepared to, talk about work that I've talked about before. And I think you probably experience this too. We get kind of sick of saying the same thing over, or we get sick of reading our own stuff, over and over again, or, yeah. And so like when there is an invitation like this one to be in conversation, sometimes by the time it comes, I just get sick of myself, and I'm just tired of hearing it. And so it can be more challenging to try to draft something new, but it feels good to be able to pay attention to the thought that I'm having, and like have a site and a space to, talk it out, write it out, work through it or whatever. So yeah, I guess the feel in that it always is like a little bit of like a, I don't know, risk is like kind of overstating the feeling. But, I also think that like in academic discourse, we're so accustomed to the kind of what's the word? People don't really take hard lines. And that contributes to the kind of boredom that people have of the academy and academic thinking. If we're all writing toward consensus, we're just continually speaking, what is that called? Speaking to the choir or something like that. We're just sort of
preaching to the choir.
Preaching to the choir. Yeah, there you go. So for my own mental health, it helps to be like, no, I think this is fucking stupid. Like, let's talk about it.
I'm wondering also to encourage folks, like if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, raise your hand. I'm also wondering to this point about maybe highlighting disagreement, that in the two presentations, I think that there's a different kind of relationship to temporality, right? I think, Dr. Bey is talking a lot about the to come, right? What's possible, right? As you say, beyond the carcerality of the gender binary, to get through gender, to get to something much, much wider, right? And also I think in your published work, talking about the sort of what's beyond, right, the present, and sort of losing the present. And in Dr. Adeyemi's talk, I hear about the, as you were sort of prefacing it with the work that you've already done, thinking about what's the ordinary that's rendered uneventful, right? But also talking about the need to engage with the ordinariness of the diversity of Black genders and sexualities in ways that don't understand that range as necessarily being institutionally functioning as a figure for radicality, for non-normativity, right? The kind of uneventfulness of the presentness of that diversity, right? So I'm wondering if both of you might want to speak to kind of how you think about that question of temporality or tense, or what it means to focus on the now or the to come, or how you think about the relation between those as a scholarly practice, as a political practice.
Mhm. Marquis, do you want to go?
I'll go. I'll try to be brief, which probably won't happen. So yeah. So I think for me, I am quite, and I've long, or not long, but it's only somewhat recently that I've come to, I hate this word, but I'm just going to use it out of utility, that I've come to own my own kind of emphasis on the beyond possibility, I'm not even going to say the future, but just like a kind of otherwise that has indexed in it a kind of not now, though I'm quite okay with that. I'm quite okay with that. I do think though, for me, I do try to emphasize at times the way that the conditions of the now, of the present, are the conditions that we act upon in order to get to that. So it's not so much for me, which is not, I don't think, what you're saying, but it's not so much for me that I don't care about the present. I care deeply about it and the things that people are living through in this present moment. I think for me though, I very much want to recognize the ways that the present is not the thing that I or that others with whom I'm in community want. So how can I emphasize the possibilities of what we might achieve, aspire toward, et cetera, as precisely the thing that gets us through the present in ways that facilitate the actualization of that beyond those possibilities, et cetera, especially because those possibilities that I am yearning for, I'll particularize this to myself, are by and large, they're here. They're very much here. I want to continue to emphasize that, but not here in the ways that perhaps would be most helpful, most liberatory, et cetera, for us. So while those possibilities are here, I think I emphasize a not now because I want to give a bit more primacy to those other things that we might have been, that we might aspire toward, that we might be able to live through and with. Because for me, I'm quite hopeful, I'll say, fugitively hopeful, as I say in the book. But in that hope is a kind of knowing that this is not all we have, and even in the here, there is more than here is touted to be. So how can we, in fact, try to think about all the things that we might become and that we might have been were it not for the conditions of here. So that's how I'm at least trying to very troublingly sit with that kind of a vexed temporality, I think.
I love that answer. And I'm like, couldn't be more opposite. Like, I'm famously avoidant of the future and of future thinking. And I think my approach to my thinking is very much, you mentioned something like, what did you say? The present is not something that I want. The present is not something that we want. And I'm like, well, the present is the only thing we have. And so what I think in my book, I'm really thinking about how do people make do with the present? Sure, they might have, that future in mind, that sort of optimistic future in mind. And actually that optimism is what keeps people going back to the nightclub, even when it's very unsatisfying. But so I'm interested in how people make do with that cruel optimism, and like literally how do they manipulate and manage their bodies in order to like carry that sort of impossible timeline forward with them every single day. And so that for me forces me to think at a more smaller scale about the methods that we have for experiencing time, really. And so the dance floor then, for example, becomes a really good site where we can track, like literally in a beat, how people are experiencing time. But yeah, I really appreciate that question, Mark.
And again, I'd encourage folks, if you have any questions, something has come in. So this is from Lau Maliver. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. Thank you. I'm intrigued by two things. I'm curious about Marquis's invitation to remain loose and unsettled as a practice of justice, where we may witness the doors dissolving. What other portals become available when these dissolve? Where do they appear? And to Kemi's point of palpability, why do you think these consolidations, such as the retreat, are so often engendered? It seems to me that in both cases of doors dissolving and consolidations engendering, there is a desire, urge, need to meet ourselves anew, whether we are aware of that or not.
I think that speaks to our responses to the earlier question. Like, I think for me, the challenge of something like the loophole convening is, yes, there's that desire, that urge to meet, that need to meet ourselves anew. But we somehow, for some reason, cannot unpack that very desire itself and how it is rooted in a really normative rendering of what community looks like, you know? And so that for me is, at least in my work, the importance of looking at the now and the recent history more than just orienting toward the desire. Because if we frame the loophole of retreat convening only through a kind of future temporality, it's a success, right? Because the success is actually, we've all desired to come together in modes anew. And we don't have to then say, well, who was there? What were the talks given? Who paid for you to get there? Where was everybody staying? You know what I mean? Those are the material details that tell us actually what the possibilities of meeting together anew could possibly be.
And I think I actually will be brief on here. Hey, Lau, I owe you a text, so I'll text you after this. Yeah, so in terms of like what kind of portals might be open in the kind of doors dissolving, I'm going to share a story, a really, really brief story that I've shared before. So I was given a talk saying similar things, as I've said, but on a different kind of register. And I was earlier on in the development of these thoughts, or rather in the development of my articulation of these thoughts. And someone very rightly, I think, and also very passionately as well, asked me, so if we get rid of all these things, if we kind of de-emphasize all these things, these identities, these modes of collectivity, etc., what then do we have? What do I have? This person said. And my response, this is the first and probably only time that I felt that I had like a response that felt good to me. And my response to that was that we have everything else. Like that to me is the thing that, for me, it feels very much the case that we are unable to get to these other modalities of relation precisely because we, I guess, to use the language that has gotten jumped on so much by Jennifer Nash, so much holding on, and I'm so deeply, terrifyingly interested in what happens, what might happen if we let go. So the dissolving of these doors is, to me, the possibility that we'll see what happens, even though it's going to be absolutely terrifying. It's going to hurt in so many ways. We might lose our sense of self and connection with other people. But to me, that's the condition of possibility for these other modes that might be so much more terrifyingly, but also beautifully liberatory for us. So in the dissolving of the doors, I think is the possibility that we might be everything else that we might have been.
Right. So if there are other questions that folks have, if you want to put it in the chat or sort of raise hands. I mean, one thing that also that occurs to me, and again, because I keep coming back to this question of this sort of the tense or temporality as it plays out differently in these arguments. But Kemi, part of what I hear you saying is the desire to, I'm forgetting what the exact language was, but to come together anew. That's not quite what it was, but it's the part of what I hear you saying is that the idea that of the new is part of the problem, right? In the sense that it allows an imagination of a kind of transcendence, right? Which then can lose track of what isn't new, what's quotidian, what's everyday, what's taken to be not exciting enough to be new, but that is the variety of Black sexualities and gender and the wide range of just lived Black sexualities and genders that don't get to count as the kind of site of a new. Does that seem to be a kind of fair reading of what you're saying?
100%. Yeah, absolutely. I have nothing to add on to that. Yeah.
And so we have another question. Sampada had a question earlier. This is from Mia Imani. Sampada had a question earlier that I wanted to bring back into the conversation, and then there's quoting Sampada. I'm also super curious about how the content of the talk's presentations also might reflect your central question. And this is Kemi, I think, from your presentation. Both who appears and what knowledge is presented might work together in terms of the lasting impact of the retreat and how it gets historicized.
Yeah. I'll have to think about that because I have to think about that. I think because I think the problem or the challenge of that retreat is it will get historicized as this important historic moment, which it was and is. But when we think about when we ourselves go into the historical archive and we have the benefit of time and distance and different kinds of vocabularies to interpret that historic moment, differently. And I think about the documentation of this event, and I think about, okay, in 100 years, when we mark this as some sort of, event in the history of Black feminist convening, what's missing? Who's missing? And there's just so much missing. And I think that given the story Black feminism tells itself about the work of Black feminism, it's a kind of huge oversight, basically, to have such a kind of formally elitist gathering. And when I say sort of formally elitist, I mean like the cost of entry is prohibitive, the travel is prohibitive and impossible for a lot of people who might not have the kinds of citizenship papers that allow them to cross borders. You know what I mean? Let alone the financial resources to attend or the temporal resources to attend. And so the way that this is going to be historicized is that it's just continuing to consolidate this block of elite Black feminism. And that's already institutionalized, and it's just going to continue to be entrenched and continue to be the status quo for how we organize around Black feminist thinking and how we learn of its reproducibility and its successful reproducibility. Do you know what I mean? So I think at a practical level, I'm just like, what would have happened if each of those, people sponsored somebody from a rural technical college to show up? It's not that complicated. We have the resources, invite the people that you claim to be, invested in, that you claim to be writing toward. And so in terms of the impact of the retreat and how it gets historicized, it's just sort of a self-perpetuating story, I guess. I don't know if that's the right way of phrasing it, that contributes to the people's ongoing discontent with what happens in the academy and what the academy does.
So I'm wondering if switching gears a little, if you both might speak to kind of how you see your work contributing to kind of queer and trans methods, right, in Black studies, and also might speak to what you think is sort of exciting that's happening in Black queer and trans studies kind of now, or where you think, right, things could go, should go. You know, I'll leave that there.
I'll just say I get excited by a lot of things, I guess. And I think part of that is the particular way, because there are different ways to inhabit this space, but the particular way that I inhabit specifically Black trans studies, I think I just find myself incredibly excited because like, so for example, Cameron Awkward Rich just came out with a book, The Terrible We, on trans maladjustment. And like, even though Cam and I depart in some ways, as I think any academic departs from any other academic in the field, but like it feels to me, I think that my excitement with respect to Black trans studies comes from a kind of seeing an emergence of an emergence of people kind of I keep using this word that I hate, but take a kind of ownership over like, yeah, I not only am I someone who historically contemporarily should not be here, but I am not only here, but I am moving in ways that are unapologetic, that are attempting to say things that don't maybe sometimes not necessarily line up with the thing that people presume, or I might be taking this in a direction that has not been taken in before. So I find myself incredibly excited by work that's coming out. And I think particularly in the ways that that work is exuding a kind of texture tone of unapologeticness in what it's saying, what it's arguing, who it's in conversation with as well. I think that's I can get into a whole bunch of stuff, but I think for me that's the brief-ish answer, a kind of excitement because of this posture of unapologeticness. At least that I'm witnessing. Other folks might not be witnessing it in the same way, and that's fine too. But I'm witnessing it in that way.
I think, yeah, I agree with what you're saying. And I was thinking about that, a language of unapologeticness, and thinking about part of the question being like, what methods are we seeing or kind of inspired by? And for me, that sense of unapologeticness is also about a kind of tone and affect that feels interesting and engaging. So I'm interested in work that kind of has a hard line or is unapologetic, or that can like look like just crystal clear language, or it can look like definitive statements, which can often be hard to find in academic writing. I think what's interesting and exciting to me in Black queer and trans studies is work that has a critique of knowledge production, and that has a critique of capitalism, and that has a critique of imperialism in it. And we're in a US academic environment where we're not often encouraged to forge truly, sort of trans diasporic alliances. In name, yes, in practice, no. And so I'm always encouraged by work that is doing that kind of labor.
We have a question in the chat. First, thank you so much, Dr. Adeyemi and Dr. Bey, for both your wonderful and generous presentations. Underlying both of your words and work is a resounding emphasis on care and joy. Dr. Rifkin, I love your question on temporality engagement with the present, future to come across both presentations. My question is if and how y'all envision ruptures of the present to live momentarily in that future to come. And then as I feel like y'all already started answering a lot of this question earlier, but I do love returns, revisitations, if y'all would like to jump back into the question of time.
I'm just sort of clarifying the question. So basically, how do we envision ruptures of the present to live momentarily in the future to come? Like, I'm interpreting that as kind of like the sort of like temporary utopia kind of framework. Is that what we're thinking about? Unless maybe Marquis, you've got.
That's how I read it. That's how I read it.
I mean, I think my work is largely about the dance floor, which is a place that people continually return to feel out of body and out of mind in certain kinds of ways. And so, I think a lot of framing of nightlife studies uses that framework of the kind of temporary utopia where the dance floor is, this release from reality and from everyday life, which I try to push against. But that is definitely like a place where I think people can inhabit that moment that you're, sort of asking about. But it's extremely temporary, to the point where it's kind of a non-existing time space but the desire to experience that is what keeps people coming back to the dance floor, if that makes sense.
I want to emphasize the temporariness too, because these things are quite temporary. So, and also for me, like it can look like a whole range of things to the point where I wouldn't even want to prescribe like, here are the places where that rupture happens, because I think for me, I think it's less about the place, the space, though there are things about certain kinds of spaces that permit certain feelings, desires, access to things, etc. But I think also it's very much about like what's happening in this space and who else is there in that space or who is not there in that space, because that also I think is a part of it. So it can look, I don't know. I just taught this the other day, so this is on my mind. Like, it could look like the freedom school that students at UCLA kind of created in the likeness of the Undercommons back in 2016, or it can look like somebody. It could look like somebody like in their garden doing that kind of cultivation of the land and the soil. It can look like any number of things, but the temporariness of that is, I think, very much a key. And I think the shift I would make with that reckoning of the temporariness of it is that these temporary moments accumulate. So for me, I want to try to think about and emphasize the accumulation of these temporary moments, such that there's a feeling of maybe a critical mass, that something feels something feels different. Something feels quite different than simply it's this moment and then it's that moment, but I'm still ensconced in all of this nightmarish kind of stuff. That these moments accumulate, that there are ways for these moments to accumulate, I think also has a kind of substantive difference as well, at least to me, in how I encounter and experience those moments of rupture.
So we still have a little bit of time left. Something that I'm wondering about, based on Marquis, just the comment you were just offering, that if the kinds of freedom that you're both speaking to sort of emerge within the kind of temporary, right? And Kemi, if you were talking about the ways that something like the loophole of retreat, right, gathering is occurring within, it's this institutionalized event occurring within this matrix of institutions having to do with the state, international commerce, the sort of networks of the art world. I'm wondering if then, thinking about what a sort of better sociality looks like, right? Sort of given the kinds of queer and trans, right, analyses you both are mounting, how to think that without institutionality? Is there a different kind of institutionality? What does the sort of sustaining of something that is freer, more just, less carceral, like what does that, if you might speak to what that looks like, or how to conceptualize that, especially given the sort of critique of institutionality that you both are offering?
Yeah, that's hard. Like that's a hard question that I, at least right now, I'm not really equipped to answer. And I think it's important for me to name that. I don't know. I don't know like what that looks like, what it feels like, what kind of things we might do to get outside to sustain, because for me the point is the sustained like aspect of it, because we can point to a lot of things that ultimately, I'm not going to say fail, but that ultimately ended, and like, how do we think about something that's sustained? And I don't know. I genuinely don't know. And the only thing I perhaps can offer is something that's not super, super helpful, I don't think, but it's the thing that's coming to mind, is this kind of a emphasis on or noticing of the less the like these kind of moments of gathering or kind of spectacularization of this moment or this thing happening, and thinking about like what are the moments in which I am maybe walking with someone or reading this thing or like or texting this person. Like for me, the sustained aspect of it comes in a kind of a quotidianness, I suppose, because I'm so uninterested in the kind of spectacular or what I understand as the spectacular. So like the kind of quotidian, quiet moments of just like, yeah, I like this doesn't seem like all that big of a deal, but it kind of is, precisely because big deals are made of these small little deals. So like these moments of like being in whatever kind of relationship to someone, even if it's like a kind of digital relationship as well, or a relationship in which you are sitting with someone's ideas or experiences in genuine and ethical ways. Those might be something. I don't think that's the thing that you're trying to get at, and I don't think that's the thing either. But I think that's a thing to perhaps sit with, or the thing that I often sit with.
I think this idea of, okay, what are other modes of sustaining forms of sociality that feel more ethical or more just in the particular arrangement of like the conference or the retreat? It's, I think, kind of easier to kind of map out. I think the first thing that has to happen is that we have to stop being self-congratulatory about the fact of our just being in the same room together as having a particular kind of political consequence. That's first and foremost. Two, we have to change the ways that we invite people into the conversation, and we have to expand our networks in order to make those invitations reach the broadest kind of population possible. And then with that, we have to redistribute our resources so that we can ensure that those people can actually be there for the conversation. So when I was talking about like, why aren't people subventing other people's, costs of attendance or whatever it may be, that seems like a really easy material thing to do. And I think we experience that like in our national, organizations, like I'm going to the American Studies Association, which I can afford to attend now. But when I was a graduate student, like that was breaking the bank for me. And there was really no sort of assistance, and I was kind of required to be there, right? So like the actual mechanics of our convening can be adjusted. They don't have to be this way. They just don't, but we make the decision time and again to continue to maintain them and enforce them, right? So I think in terms of like developing forms of sociality that might look more like the kind of futures that we want to work toward, really easy, small things can happen here. And those decisions that we make can actually kind of support our claims for a kind of like radical anti-capitalist society that we think that we're working for, but it's certainly a lot more work and a different kind of work to build that mode of sociality, but people do it all of the time. And so why don't we do it in the academy? So, the sort of that question of why don't we do it needs to be interrogated. And I think that's part of what this next project is kind of, building toward.
Thank you so much for your presentations and for your engagement. Thank you so much to everyone who came out on a Friday afternoon. And I'm so excited that we could have this conversation, and thank you for everyone for being present for it.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. This was wonderful. I'm so grateful to have been here with all of you. Thank you, Kemi. Thank you, Mark. This was wonderful. So I'm deeply, deeply appreciative. I really am.
Thank you. Yeah, same.